Thank you for coming. It's wonderful to see everyone. I'm Esme Berg, the acting president and executive director of the New Amsterdam History Center. And on behalf of the New Amsterdam History Center trustees, I'd like to welcome you here this evening to hear a fascinating talk by Jaap Jacobs, The Lawyer and the Fox, A Tale of Tricks and Treachery in New Amsterdam. We feel very fortunate to have Jaap with us tonight, as this has been in the planning stage for at least 2 years. A special word of welcome to the Consul General, although I don't think he's here yet, but he's planning to come. But the Consul General of the Netherlands was extremely helpful in helping us to make tonight's lecture possible. Without them, it would not be possible. We have a few people coming from the consulate. Maybe they had a big event today, so they're probably on their way. I also want to thank Andrew Terhune, who's not here this evening, but he's the president of the Holland Society, and also has been working with us very closely. I understand that William Hoek from the Netherland Club was going to be here, and I wanted to thank the Netherland Club for hosting us this evening, and to Verlie van Buren and Catherine Bos van Lempt, excuse my Dutch, for all of their help in tonight. I also want to welcome and thank our patrons. Without your loyal support, it's your loyal support that helps to make lectures like this and our many other activities possible. There are forums outside if you aren't yet a member or a patron of the New Amsterdam, we call it patrons of the New Amsterdam History Center. I invite you to join, and you'll find out that you'll enjoy that. We have some very loyal followers, and you'd like to join them. The New Amsterdam History Center is in the midst of a period of growth and renewal, including a search for a new president. So if anybody would like to be our president, just come and see me, or have any ideas of anyone who might be, but providing a number of opportunities to support us. Please mark your calendars for our next lecture, which is on December 4th. It's called A Dangerous Liberty, Mohawk-Dutch Relations and the Colonial Gunpowder Trade. Very interesting talk, I've heard it, about the importance of gunpowder in New Amsterdam, New Netherland. To be presented by Sean Sayers on December 4th. Check your inboxes, invitations will go out, and it's also will be on our website. Also, Jaap Jacobs' book is for sale, and he'll sign the copies if you'd like to purchase them. And now I'd like to call upon our New Amsterdam History Center trustee, Firth Haring-Fabian, to introduce our speaker. Firth holds a PhD from New York University and is the author of a number of books about New Netherland, including A Dutch Family in the Middle Colonies, 1660 to 1800, Zion on the Hudson, and in her most recent book, New Netherland in a Nutshell, A Concise History of the Dutch Republic in North America. Firth.
Thank you, Esme, and welcome everybody.
David.
I first met Jaap in 1993 on Martha Shattuck's deck. That was 25 years ago. In those 25 years, Jaap has been so busy that his CV, his long version of his CV, now runs to 31 single-space pages. He is known and respected wherever historians and buffs of New Netherland exist, and we are pleased and proud to have him with us tonight. Jaap received his PhD from Leiden University in 1999 and is an honorary reader at St. Andrews University in Scotland. What is salient for us about his work here in New York, whether we are historians or history buffs, is his book, The Colony of New Netherland, A Dutch Settlement in 17th Century America. Copies are available for sale and signing. Please welcome Jaap.
Right. Thank you first for that very kind introduction. Good evening. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be here tonight in this great city of New York. I love the city and I have visited it many times. However, there is another city that I love too, and that's the city of my birth, Leiden, in the Netherlands. I should actually be there this very day, on the 3rd of October. It's a very important day in Leiden. It's a day of exuberant celebration. Today, Leiden commemorates the lifting of the siege in the second half of the 16th century. To give you a bit of historical background, the Low Countries had started a rebellion against their ruler, Philip II, who also happened to be King of Spain. By 1574, things were not going well for the rebellion. Leiden, strategically located in the middle of the south of Holland, was besieged by Spanish troops. And you can actually see the siege going on here. The inhabitants were dying from famine and disease. William of Orange, the rebellion's leader, tried to reach the city with his troops, the so-called sea beggars, on flat-bottomed boats, but they made slow progress. They're over here, near Delft. So that's Delft. The Hague is over there, Schiedam over here, Rotterdam over there. So north is north of Leiden, actually, on that side. You have to put it on the side, as it were. By early October, in 1574, the situation in Leiden had become desperate. And then suddenly, the Spanish army appeared to have left. As the traditional story goes, an orphan boy, Cornelis Joppens, slipped out of the city, made his way towards the Spanish lines, and found them deserted. What he did find was a large kettle with hutspot, a dish of mashed potato and vegetables. Soon afterwards, the flat-bottomed boats over here reached the city and provided the starving inhabitants with bread and herring, which, with hutspot, is still, or rather again, traditional fare in Leiden on October the 3rd. My friends on Facebook, many of them who live in Leiden, have actually posted photographs of bread and herring and hutspot and having the celebrations and the parade. I should be there. The people of Leiden were jubilant, and so was William of Orange. As a reward for its stout defense, he offered Leiden a choice between tax exemptions or the foundation of a university. Whether Leiden made the right choice is still questioned by some, but the university quickly acquired an excellent reputation as a seat of learning. It attracted such theologians as Jacob Arminius and Franciscus Gomarus, who were able to discuss the finer points of predestination over their garden fence, in Latin of course. Nowadays, only a few people in Leiden are able to speak Latin. The faculty of law was of high quality too, with students such as Hugo Grotius and many others. And that brings me to the Leiden lawyer in the title of my talk today, Adriaen van der Donck. Now actually, we don't know whether this is a picture of Van der Donck. It's the National Gallery in Washington still lists this as a portrait of an anonymous French man. But in an exhibition in the 1920s, it was paraded around as Adriaen van der Donck. So there we are. Adriaen van der Donck is best known as the writer of A Description of New Netherland, which remains an important source for the history of the Dutch colony. Van der Donck was born in Breda only a few years before that city was conquered by Habsburg forces in 1625. Van der Donck and his parents fled north and were only able to return after the army of the Dutch Republic captured the city in 1637, 12 years later. A year later, Van der Donck matriculated at Leiden University to read law. He was subsequently employed by Kiliaan van Rensselaer to serve as chief judicial officer at the patroonship of Rensselaerswijk in New Netherland. After leaving van Rensselaer's service, he started his own patroon ship, Donck, just north of Manhattan. Van der Donck became involved in the politics of New Netherland, which was rife with divisions in the aftermath of a devastating war with the Native Americans, for which the West India Company was blamed. In 1649, Van der Donck traveled to the Dutch Republic with 2 other delegates to present their complaints to the States General in the form of a remonstrance. After his return to New Netherland in 1653, Van der Donck stayed out of public life until his untimely death at the hands of Native Americans. Historians of New Netherland have largely viewed Van der Donck in a positive vein. In the 19th century, Edmund Bailey O'Callaghan, a journalist of Irish origin who had fled to New York after getting into trouble with the authorities in British-ruled Canada, recognized his own travails in Van der Donck's life and portrayed him as the leader of a popular movement that foreshadowed the American Revolution. Likewise, Russell Shorto, in his best-selling Island at the Center of the World, depicts Van der Donck as a Cartesian paragon of early enlightenment, a conduit for Dutch tolerance into North America, and a shining example for our own troubled times. I have to say here that although I will criticize Russell's work in the upcoming lecture, I have a great respect for him, and his book has done more for New Netherlands studies than anybody else could have done. It has brought attention to this field in a way that it had never had before. He is a very engaging writer. That goes for his other books as well. And whenever he is present, he sent his apologies to me that he couldn't be here tonight. He always acknowledges the work of scholars, of whom actually quite a number are present here tonight. But I find it very hard to reconcile this positive image of Adriaen van der Donck, which is also in Julie van den Hout's recent biography of Van der Donck. I find it hard to reconcile that image with the historical record. Van der Donck did not play a role in the struggles of Jews, Quakers and Lutherans for tolerance, as these for the most part took place after his death in 1655. Also, the chronology of Van der Donck's life argues against any influence by René Descartes. By the time that Descartes' thinking acquired traction in the Dutch Republic, actually that was in Utrecht, not in Leiden, Van der Donck had already departed for America. On top of that, none of Van der Donck's writings display distinctly Cartesian traits. In fact, Van der Donck's life in many ways points the other way, showing signs of orthodox, even militant Calvinism. The self-imposed exile of Van der Donck's family from Breda during the Spanish occupation, Catholics, is a sign. His marriage to a daughter of a Puritan minister from England and his continuing membership of the Calvinist Church, all of that suggests that his engagement in colonial projects stemmed from religious motives, similar to those of New England colonists. The desire to create a safe haven overseas. In that sense, it seems likely that Van der Donck entertained religious ideas quite similar to those of Petrus Stuyvesant. And Petrus Stuyvesant is, of course, the fox in my talk tonight. He requires only a brief introduction. He was born into an Orthodox Calvinist family in the early 16th teens in Peperga in Friesland, a province in the north of the Dutch Republic. Stuyvesant enrolled as a student at the University of Franeker in 1630. He subsequently served the Dutch West India Company in a minor function on the Brazilian island of Fernão de Noronha. After a brief return to the Netherlands, he went to Curaçao in 1639, where he was in charge of the stores. He became director of the island in 1642, but he returned to the Netherlands again after losing his right leg, leading an attack on the Spanish-held island of St. Martin. Now, Stuyvesant is, of course, as you know, buried at St. Mark's here on Manhattan, and the church has a number of walking tours of the area. In one of those, the losing of his leg is mentioned as one of the fun facts. I'm sure that he himself didn't quite experience it that way. After getting his health back, Stuyvesant was appointed as Director General of New Netherland. His 17 years in charge reveal a drive towards a Calvinist society, truly reformed and thoroughly reformed. If van der Donck and Stuyvesant had a similar religious outlook, what then lies at the root of their conflict? Now, this question has been on my mind for a considerable time. Over 20 years ago, I came upon a letter by Adriaen van der Donck dated April 15th, 1650. Now, there's something odd about this letter. It is not in van der Donck's own handwriting, but it is a copy made by one of the clerks of the Amsterdam Chamber of the West India Company. And this copy made its way to the archive of the Amsterdam city government. There can only be one conclusion. Van der Donck's correspondence was intercepted, opened, and copied. This copy was subsequently used by the directors of the West India Company to jolt the Amsterdam city government into action. Dirty trick number 1. Just 5 days later, April 20th, 1650, the Amsterdam directors decided to inform Stuyvesant that the ingratitude and treachery of the delegates from New Netherland had now become evident. They did not mention van der Donck's letter, or his name actually, but they advised Stuyvesant, and I quote, to act with the cunning of a fox. I looked at both of these documents again a few years ago. I was working on a chapter of my biography of Stuyvesant and decided that this struggle of van der Donck and Stuyvesant required further research, but from a different angle. In order to fully understand what was going on, I needed to look at both van der Donck's and Stuyvesant's connections. Now, networks, whether familial, religious, professional, or in this case political, can go a long way towards explaining the actuals of individuals in the past. And actually, the research of Susanna Shaw-Romney, who's present here, shows that in detail. Now, in some ways, historical research is similar to a criminal investigation, tracing who was in contact with whom, at which moment, at what place, and to what purpose. Of course, NYPD detectives have modern means at their disposal and are able to tap into different sources than a historian studying the 17th century. We can't interview witnesses, if only we could. But then the standards for reasonable doubt in a court of historians are less exacting, also because historians are not generally inclined to declare people guilty. Stuyvesant's network might be the easiest, as his main contacts were already known. The directors of the Amsterdam Chamber of the West India Company, they had appointed him. Van der Donck's network was a bit more difficult. So what I did with the 1650s letters as my starting point is to reconstruct the struggle between van der Donck and Stuyvesant and their networks in New Netherland and the Dutch Republic as they evolved over 5 years, 1647, 1653, actually a little beyond, so it's more than 5 years. So that reconstruction is the basis of my talk tonight. Now this is going to be a network analysis, so I'll show you the slow development of these networks and with the arrows, the links between people and groups. In April 1650, when these letters were written, the struggle between the two men was still undecided. Soon after arriving on Manhattan, Stuyvesant had become involved in the conflict sparked off by the actions of his predecessor, Willem Kieft. There he is. The issue of who was to blame for the war with the Native Americans was at stake here. The opposition against Kieft, whose conduct was defended by the Amsterdam directors, consisted of people of different backgrounds, settlers, merchants, and a small number of patroons and their representatives, such as Cornelis Melijn. Now, Melijn is an interesting figure. He had invested heavily in New Netherland, setting up the patroonship of Staten Island in the process. In this venture, Melijn collaborated with Godard van Rede van Nederhorst. Now this is a name you don't often hear in New Netherland history. And it's a long name too. Godard van Rede van Nederhorst was a Dutch nobleman who had become attracted to the idea of investing in a colonizing venture through the 1638 and 1640 freedoms and exemptions, a scheme set up to encourage colonization by privatizing it. There is a link here to Adriaen van der Donck too. So I add an arrow. When van der Donck contemplated going to America, he was not just in contact with Kilian van Rensselaer, but also with Godard van Rede. Instead, of course, he accepted van Rensselaer's offer, and this allowed him to acquire experience that would help him set up his own patroonship later on. In the summer of 1647, Kieft's quarrel with Melijn led to a trial resulting in the latter's banishment from New Netherland. On the way to the Dutch Republic, both men were involved in a shipwreck in which Kieft drowned, but Melijn survived. Upon his arrival in the Dutch Republic, Melijn immediately traveled to Zutphen in the eastern Netherlands to meet with Hendrik van der Capellen. Well, his name is a little better known. Not least because he's actually mentioned in the 1650 letter. Hendrik van der Capelle was a member of the Gelderland nobility who often represented his province in the States General and frequently chaired its Committee for West Indian Affairs. There is no indication that van der Capelle and Melijn had met before, and the most likely explanation is that Lubbert Dinklage had enabled the contact between the two people. This is going to grow. But at some point, people will start disappearing too, so don't worry. So here we are. The links with the States General, with the Committee for West Indian Affairs, the link between Dinklage and van der Capelle, and as I reconstructed, Dinklage was the one who, as vice director, actually told Melijn and van der Donck that they should be in contact with Hendrik van der Capelle. Van der Capelle was vice director, as I said, the second in command, and he owed his appointment to van der Capelle's influence, and he plays a rather shadowy role in this conflict. He appears to have been something of an undercover agent. Whatever the case may be there, the contact between Melijn and van der Capelle proved fruitful. Van der Capelle and Nederhorst got in contact with each other as well here. First, van der Capelle purchased Godard van Rede's part of the patroonship of Staten Island and thus aligned his personal interest with those of Melijn. Next, when Melijn submitted his papers to the States General, his complaints were forwarded to the committee chaired by van der Capelle. Through these connections, Melijn and later on van der Donck became involved in a much larger political struggle. And this requires me to explain a bit more about the situation in the Dutch Republic. Now, during the 17th century, political developments in the Dutch Republic evolved around the relation between Amsterdam and the stadtholder. The stadtholder could wield substantial power, depending on his personality and on the circumstances. In 1618, stadtholder Maurits, son of William of Orange, had used his military powers to intervene in a long-running conflict and had purged city governments in a number of places in an exceptional power grab, which included the arrest of political opponents such as Hugo Grotius. Maurits' successor, Frederik Hendrik, who should be appearing soon. You need to press the right button. Here they are. Here we have Frederik Hendrik and his son William II. Maurits' successor, Frederik Hendrik, had been much more careful and diplomatic in exerting influence than his brother, half-brother actually. But his health and strength of will began to wane in the 1640s, and his son, William II, was waiting impatiently in the wings. In the course of the 1640s, a number of Dutch noblemen had become dissatisfied, even disgusted, with the growing dominance of the province of Holland, in which the merchant-ruled city of Amsterdam held prime position. They coalesced around the stadtholder, first Frederik Hendrik, and then William II. The most important issue in the 1640s was the question of war or peace with Spain. Peace would benefit Amsterdam's trade, but it also would lead to a reduction in the size of the Dutch army, thus taking away career opportunities for sons of noble families. It would make it difficult for William II to make a name for himself on the battlefield, and he was keen for that, actually. Some of the factions supporting William II, for instance, Alexander van der Capelle, brother of Hendrik van der Capelle, were adherents of an ideology that stressed the hereditary privilege and duty of the nobility to govern. Alexander even wrote a Latin tract, De ambitione plebeiorum supra nobiles, the ambition of the people against the nobility, which dealt with the fear of many noblemen that the cities would try to usurp the government of the land. In the opinion of these noblemen, the failures of the West India Company in Brazil and New Netherland were caused by the inherent unsuitability of merchants for positions of governmental authority. That rings a bell in these troubled times of ours. The merchant's natural focus on self-interest, guided by mercantile considerations instead of the general welfare, was anathema to noblemen to whom honor was paramount. You can actually see from this painting that this man was a nobleman. You know what it is? It's the elbow. And the hand folded inwards, usually actually holding the sword. He doesn't hold a sword in this particular painting, but whenever you see an elbow like that in a 16th, 17th, or even 18th century picture, that's a clear indication. So, we have Alexander van der Capelle. There he is, in his right place in the network. Alexander and Hendrik and Van Rede van Nederhorst were members of the, what I call for this purpose, stadtholder faction. These factions were not modern-style political parties with a clearly defined purpose and strong leadership. Rather, they were loose groups of men who at times found their individual interests aligned along the same axis and then acted upon the opportunities as they arose. Some of the members of the stadtholder faction were publicly known to be on the side of the stadtholders, but others were not clearly identified as such and carefully hedged their bets, as public failure would imply loss of face, honor being paramount to these men. The stadtholder faction often had to use stealth and dirty tricks in order to achieve its objectives. And the decentralized and sometimes Byzantine decision-making processes in the Dutch Republic allowed ample scope for that. While the estates of each province remained sovereign, general decisions on defense and foreign policy were dealt with by the States General, which met at the Binnenhof in The Hague. And that's the place in The Hague that you can see here. This is not how it looks nowadays. This is around 1614. Even by 1650, many places here had disappeared. The chapel had been demolished. By 1655, this hall where the States of Holland had their meetings had been rebuilt. The stadtholder, by 1650, no longer, lived in this tower. The States General actually met in a building over here, so it's quite close from where the States of Holland met. Usually, the pictures that we have of the States General in a meeting are of an exceptional meeting, which took place in the Ridderzaal. That was called the Grote Vergadering, and you probably have seen it with all the banners hanging down. It's a very, very well-known picture. But that actually is a very exceptional situation. During the course of the 17th century, the plenary sessions of the States General, over here, over here, gradually became the place where decisions that had been prepared in committee meetings were rubber stamped. The States General had plenary meetings just about every day. The chair of the plenary sessions rotated among the provinces on a weekly basis, sort of like the European Union nowadays. The committee meetings, however, were always chaired by the member with the highest rank present, the ranking member. That usually was Gelderland, which, as a duchy, ranked higher than Holland, which was only a county. The committee meetings took place in the morning, before the plenary session started, or in the afternoon, after the plenary session had ended. Many people were involved in the meetings of the States General over a year, about 80 to 100, but only about 15 of them attended more than 40% of the meetings. This was the core group that determined policies, and of which Hendrik and Alexander van der Capelle were part. Several very carefully planned measures were required for the stadtholder faction to get the plenary sessions of the States General to pass the resolutions it wanted. First, a draft resolution had to be prepared in a committee. The moment that either Alexander van der Capelle or Hendrik van der Capelle was in The Hague was the moment that they chaired the Committee for West Indian Affairs. Holland would also usually have a member there. And that meant that the committee chair could only push through a draft resolution if the Holland representative did either not come from Amsterdam or was not one of that city's trusted confidants. So you really had to know who was on which side in order to make your move. Second, a draft resolution had to go through the plenary session of the States General. Whether a draft resolution was tabled depended on who occupied the chair, so which week it was. The chair rotated, with each of the provinces taking their turn, but if it was a member from Friesland, or from Gelderland, or from Utrecht, then there were opportunities. For instance, from Utrecht, we have the brother of Godard van Rede, Johan van Rede van Renswoude. The latter part is, of course, the estates that they had. The chair determined the agenda and usually kept a close eye on the interests of his own province, of himself, and of his network. Third, the draft resolution had to be brought to a vote at a favorable moment. There were several ways to push a resolution through. Draft resolutions were not circulated on paper, but were read aloud by the main clerk, distracting opponents by engaging them in conversation so that they could not pay attention to what was going on. It was one way. Introducing a draft resolution when specific members were absent, either because of a call for nature or because a committee meeting was running overtime, was another trick. And of course, if you've got the chair here and you've got the chair in the States General, you can arrange for anybody who stays in there that they are not in the plenary meeting at the moment that the real important decision is being taken. So these were all tricks that were being used. And fourth, if a potentially controversial decision made it through, it would help if the distracted opponents would not become aware of the contents of the decision straight away and then try to revoke it. Now this is where the research really became tricky, because this meant that for 1649 through to 1653, I had to research just about every day that the States General met to see who was present. And that would only give partial information. It would give a list of names of those who were at some point during that day present. They would all be listed. But you wouldn't know which members at which moment during that meeting. So there is some surmise in here. But generally, you can come to some conclusions. All the decisions relating to New Netherland, Van der Donck and Melijn went through committee stage at the moment when Alexander and Hendrik van der Capelle were in The Hague. And all those resolutions were introduced in the plenary session of the States General when the chair was a member of the stadtholder faction. So let us leave The Hague for a moment and go to New Netherland, as did Cornelis Melijn. He arrived back in New Amsterdam in early 1649. He had obtained through the means just described, a provisional appeal from the States General that suspended his banishment, and he had a letter to Stuyvesant recalling him, asking Stuyvesant to be present in person or send a representative to the States General as the designated court of appeal. Now, this was a very difficult decision, actually, because the States General technically did not have the power to determine where the court of appeal would be. So there was quite a bit of an issue there. However, because Melijn had also brought along a letter of William II, the stadtholder, and that is the clear link between all of these persons, a letter to Stuyvesant ordering him, come back and defend yourself, that clearly shows that he had powerful friends and that their complaints were being heeded. So it made clear to Lubbert Dinklage and to Adriaen van der Donck that an attempt to reform the colony's government might succeed. Up to this point, Adriaen van der Donck had played a relatively minor role in the conflict, even though he did have a seat on the colony's advisory council, the 9 men. Now, however, Adriaen van der Donck decided to take center stage. He began to prepare a remonstrance to the States General, outlining the problems of New Netherland and requesting substantial support. For this purpose, he proposed sending a delegation to the Dutch Republic. In itself, that was not a problem. Stuyvesant did not object to the proposal as such. But according to him, a delegation had to be initiated by a colonial assembly. The 9 men actually only did, at that point, civil justice in New Amsterdam. They did not represent the entirety of New Netherland. This counter-proposal of Stuyvesant was a problem, an obstacle to the plans of van der Donck. His main aim was to strengthen the influence of patroons by reforming the colonial government of New Netherland through adding patroon members to Director General and Council, of which Stuyvesant was, of course, the main member. There were other members as well. A colonial assembly with the representatives of villages and patroonships would make it much more difficult to draw up a remonstrance that would criticize the West India Company and at the same time advocate governmental reform. In the course of 1649, this conflict became to an outburst. Open conflict broke out and the 2 men, Stuyvesant and van der Donck, had taken up entrenched positions. Clearly, the standoff had to be resolved by authorities in the Dutch Republic. So van der Donck and his co-delegates made the transatlantic journey and then used several means to further their cause. For instance, they produced an inflammatory pamphlet entitled Broad Advice, which you can see over here, Brede Raad aan de Verenigde Nederlandse Provinciën. This anonymous pamphlet blames, and here it gets really interesting, blames the mercantile considerations of the directors of the West India Company for their failure to properly govern the colonies. Hey, we've heard that before. In October 1649, van der Donck submitted several documents, including the remonstrance, the other document here, to the States General. They were turned over to its Committee for West Indian Affairs for further perusal. In its defense, the Amsterdam Chamber also submitted documents. Now, when compared with political pamphlets of the time, it becomes clear that the authors of the Broad Advice, I think it's authors, by the way, this document, this pamphlet has been attributed to Melijn, but I actually think that it was written on board of the ship on which Melijn and van der Donck, and probably a few others as well, went to the Netherlands. They talked amongst each other. Van der Donck may well have been the one who actually wrote everything down, but it's not just his work. Both the Broad Advice and the Remonstrance employed a mix of fiery rhetoric, innuendo, half-truths, and outright lies. Dirty trick number 2. And again, there is a parallel to our own times. It also included allegations of usurpation, tyranny, and arbitrary rule, which had actually been the common staple of Dutch political pamphlets since the late 16th century. In their demand for governmental reforms, the delegates from New Netherlands were deliberately vague, asking the States General to relieve the West India Company of the government of New Netherlands. Instead, they requested a competent civil government, such as your high mightinesses, the States General, will deem advisable to apply to this region, having something in common with the laudable government of our fatherland. This actually does not specifically point to a city government for New Amsterdam. Rather, the reference to region, provincie, gewest, suggests that the delegates had an institutional change at the level of Director General and Council in mind. Probably something like the meeting of the regional estates in Gelderland, with guaranteed seats for the land-owning nobility. The Amsterdam Chamber of the West India Company, confronted with this political attack, immediately sprang into action. In December 1649, the West India Company's directors briefed the city government of Amsterdam and thereby alerted their most powerful ally. Alexander van der Capelle assumed the chair of the Committee for West Indian Affairs in January 1650, which allowed the delegates from New Netherlands the opportunity to press their case. Using the fact that in February Johan van Rede van Renswoude was chairing the plenary session, the stadtholder faction managed to speed things up. And in March 1650, the Committee for West Indian Affairs sent a list of proposed measures to the plenary session of the States General. But there it hit a snag. The Holland delegates, alerted by Amsterdam, requested a paper copy, and this delayed a decision. Subsequently, delegates from Amsterdam and the States of Holland argued that the proposed measures went contrary to the authority of the West India Company chamber in their city, so in this case, Amsterdam only managed to block proposals after they had gone through the committee stage. As a result of this setback, Van der Donck and his collaborators changed tack. In April 1650, the month of the two letters that I mentioned earlier at my talk, the Committee for West Indian Affairs sent the plenary session a provisional order, with sweeping measures. It suggested a new Amsterdam city government. Now, if implemented, this would radically change the makeup of Director General and Council. And it would in future consist of the Director General and the Vice Director and 3 members, of which 1 would be jointly appointed by the West India Company and the States General, and the other 2 would be nominated by an assembly consisting of representatives of the patroons and the settlements. Second, Stuyvesant would be recalled, hence he's not named here. Third, a city government would be installed, so 3 measures. And the city government would consist of a schout, 2 burgomasters and 5 schepenen. The delegates of New Netherlands, of course, reacted enthusiastically to these proposals, especially Van der Donck, one of the very few non-absentee patroons. He would be an obviously candidate for one of the seats in Director General and Council. But of course there was immediate opposition from the Amsterdam Chamber. In their reply, the directors suggested a number of changes to the proposed reforms. They also objected to the recall of Stuyvesant, but remained silent about the proposed city government for New Amsterdam. And actually, the proposed format for New Amsterdam was not controversial. There was no reason for the Amsterdam directors to object to it. Far more important was what the powers of this new Amsterdam city government would be, and even more so, who would be appointed to it. In addition, the Amsterdam directors resorted to dirty trick number 3, a job offer. They promised to send François Dekkers to New Netherlands as supercargo and ordered Stuyvesant to provide him with a suitable employment there. This was a favor to Gijsbert van der Holk, the Utrecht burgemeester, who was the uncle of François Dekkers. Van der Holk was a delegate to the States General and a regular member of its Committee for West Indian Affairs. In this way, the Amsterdam Chamber managed to send back the provisional order to the Committee for West Indian Affairs. and there it stayed for a while. As political tensions in the Dutch Republic reached boiling point in the summer of 1650, with the country on the brink of civil war, the reforms of New Netherland lost urgency. The tension subsided when Stadtholder William II suddenly died in November 1650. Now, this turn of events had major consequences. Alexander and Hendrik van der Capelle, for much of 1651, were unable to further the cause of the New Netherland delegates. In contrast, the death of the stadtholder removed the political pressure on the Amsterdam Chamber. The Amsterdam directors became so confident that they could afford to ignore requests from The Hague for more information. For instance, the Committee for West India Affairs, spurred on by Van der Donck, wanted to interrogate Jan Janse Damen, who happened to be in the Dutch Republic at the time. Damen had been one of the primary agitators in the attack on the Native Americans in 1643 that initiated Kief's War, and would thus be a prime witness against the West India Company. The committee wrote to the Amsterdam Chamber asking them to send Damen to The Hague, but the Amsterdam Chamber replied that Damen had already left for New Netherland. The dates on Amsterdam notarial documents make clear that this was in fact not the case. The Amsterdam directors willfully misinformed the committee in The Hague and deliberately obstructed its proceedings. And again, it's not entirely unfamiliar to our current times. So this was dirty trick number 4. They did the same thing in the Amsterdam directors when they allowed Secretary Cornelis van Tienhoven Adriaen to depart for New Netherland, despite the fact that the States General Committee wanted to interrogate him at The Hague. This obstruction of the Amsterdam Chamber and the absence of Alexander and Hendrik van der Capelle meant that Adriaen van der Donck had to bide his time. After months of being absent, Hendrik van der Capelle returned to The Hague on the 10th of February 1652 and immediately assumed the chair of the Committee for West India Affairs. There is no doubt that Van der Donck had kept in close contact with the Van der Capellens during his absence for that very same day. Not a day later, not a week later, that exact same day. Van der Donck entered another petition, urging a final decision on his previously submitted plans. As he planned to return to the Netherlands shortly, he asked for a speedy decision on this. As soon as this became known in Amsterdam, the Amsterdam directors, of course, took the usual action. They informed the Amsterdam burgomasters. There was still time to block pending resolutions, as Hendrik van der Capelle, who was also occasionally in The Hague, had to travel back to Gelderland to attend a meeting of the estates of that province. These men were really moving around quite a bit. But in April 1652, his brother Alexander was in The Hague again, and that allowed Van der Donck the opportunity to go for a final push. On the 27th of April, the Committee for West Indian Affairs submitted a draft resolution for the recall of Stuyvesant to the plenary session. The chair that week was Johan van Rede van Renswoude. Which dirty trick, number 5, he employed is unknown, but he managed to get the job done. Stuyvesant was ordered to return immediately. Van der Donck was granted a letter to that effect, which he was to hand to Stuyvesant personally. The Chamber of Amsterdam would be informed of the resolution by letter. Now, this plan could have worked if Van der Donck had been able to arrive in New Netherland before any counter orders reached the colony. Time was of the essence, and therefore the Amsterdam Chamber needed to be kept in the dark as long as possible. So here comes dirty trick number 6. After the plenary session of the States General on the 27th of April, Johan van Rede van Renswoude, him again, drafted a short letter to the Amsterdam directors. A copy of the resolution was to be enclosed. That's the usual procedure. Now, usually, a letter from The Hague to Amsterdam in the 17th century took no more than 2 or 3 days. In this case, the letter and the copy of the resolution, both signed by Johan van Rede van Renswoude and dated the 27th of April, did not arrive in Amsterdam until 2 weeks later, on either Saturday the 11th or Sunday the 12th of May. Clearly, Van Rede van Renswoude or someone else had deliberately delayed it. The directors in Amsterdam immediately noticed the dangerous predicament they were in, and they took 3 countermeasures. First, they tried to block van der Donck's return by sending their bookkeeper to the 2 ships about to leave for New Netherland. The skippers were ordered not to allow van der Donck to board. Second, they sent a letter to Stuyvesant informing him of the situation. They wrote that as the decision to recall had been taken without their prior knowledge and consent, Stuyvesant should not hasten back to the Dutch Republic. The third countermeasure was to dispatch to The Hague Jaap Jacobs. There he is. He is one of the directors. Van der Donck submitted his last request to the States General on Monday, May the 13th, informing them of his intention to depart with the ships lying ready at the Texel and asking for some last safeguards. But after this request was read in the plenary session, the delegates of Holland, Holland, exerted influence on the States General. The delegates of Holland requested time to consult with the full meeting of the States of Holland. This was an ill portent for van der Donck. He decided to leave without the requested papers, but still had time to go to a notary and obtain a proxy from Alexander van der Capelle to represent him in the founding of a new patroonship on Long Island. Then he left for Amsterdam, where on May the 15th he hired a few servants for his patroonship. But it was already too late. Jacob Jacobs had contacted several members of the States General and of the States of Holland, including these 2 men, Cornelis Bicker and Cornelis de Graaf. The one was an Amsterdam burgomaster, the other was a former burgomaster and a sworn enemy of the late stadtholder. With 6 or 7 other gentlemen from the States of Holland, they went over to the plenary session of the States General and asked for the resolution of April the 27th, the resolution to recall Stuyvesant. After this was read to them, they announced to the meeting that this decision required the approval of the States of Holland, which of course was not forthcoming. As a result, the resolution was withdrawn, and van der Donck was ordered to return the letter to Stuyvesant that had been handed to him. This was the final defeat for Adriaen van der Donck. It has been suggested that the decision to revoke the recall of Stuyvesant was motivated by the expected war with England. Instead, as this whole procedure showed, it was power play by Amsterdam and Holland that thwarted van der Donck's last chance. Meanwhile, in New Netherland, Stuyvesant had acted decisively. In December 1650, he ignored the nominations made by the incumbent members of the 9 men and appointed new members loyal to the West India Company. Of the members of the 9 men from 1647 through 1650, none were left in office by 1652. In addition, Lubbert van Dinklage, there he is, was forcibly ousted from his position as vice director. And forcibly in this case means calling soldiers into the meeting to say this man has to go. This was not a friendly action. These purges changed the political constellation and resulted in the opposition becoming divided. Despite their initial indignation, many former supporters of van der Donck among the merchants of New Amsterdam gradually dropped their hostility towards the West India Company and towards Stuyvesant. Meanwhile, the hardcore members of the patroon faction, such as Van Dinklage in New Netherland, van der Donck and Melijn in the Dutch Republic, were marginalized. This made it safe to grant New Amsterdam city rights, as Stuyvesant and his council suggested to the Amsterdam Chamber in 1651. After permission had been granted early in 1652, Stuyvesant proceeded to install the city government of New Amsterdam on February the 2nd, 1653. This was the earliest possible moment for such an institution, because the institution of the city government had to conform as much as possible to that of Amsterdam. Candlemas, February the 2nd, was the customary day to install new burgomasters in Amsterdam, a tradition dating back to the late 14th century. 5 of the members of the 9 men were appointed to the city government, none of them enemies of the company, thus providing the foundation for a good relationship with the Director General and Council. Putting the struggle between these 2 men, the Leiden lawyer and the Franeker fox, in its Dutch political context of its time, yields a revised interpretation of the role of participants, events, and of decisive factors. The conflict may have found its starting point in colonial events, but the trajectory was determined by shifts in the balance of power in the Dutch Republic. It was a transatlantic struggle for power between the Amsterdam Chamber, assisted by the Amsterdam city government and aided by the officers in the colony on the one hand, and a changing coalition of different groups, on the other hand, which consisted of colonists, merchants, as well as patroons, supported by the stadtholder faction in the States General on the other hand. Over the course of the struggle, this makeshift coalition began to break up. Discontented settlers only played a significant role in the first phase of the struggle from 1643 until 1647, when some of their number were members of the 8th and 12th men advisory boards that preceded the 9 men. Small and large merchants and traders were part of the opposition throughout and contributed significantly to the membership of the 9 men. By late 1650, the opponents of the company in New Amsterdam were purged from the 9 men and replaced by men more inclined towards collaboration. The patron component of the opposition lasted longer. This included Cornelis Melijn, Vice Director Lubbert Dinklage, and of course Adriaen van der Donck. Due to the First Anglo-Dutch War, van der Donck could not return to New Netherland. He spent his time in the Dutch Republic writing his description of the colony and obtaining his doctorate in law at Leiden. Before he returned, van der Donck had to promise not to meddle in politics anymore. He probably intended to make his patroonship Codendonk and the planned patroonship on Long Island a success, but he was never able to do so and tragically died in the war with the Native Americans. There is a sad irony here, as his conflict with Stuyvesant found its origins in an earlier war with the Native Americans. So what then was the main cause of the clash between van der Donck and Stuyvesant? There is no evidence to suggest that a difference of ideology or religion caused the men to fall out. Rather, it was a political struggle for hegemony. Who would rule over New Netherland? Would it be the mercantile elite of Amsterdam, the West India Company officials and Petrus Stuyvesant, or the nobility in the Dutch Republic, the patroons of New Netherland and Adriaen van der Donck? There's no reason to doubt that Stuyvesant and van der Donck both wanted the Dutch colony to grow and prosper, and that actually gives a tragic tinge to this tale of the Leiden lawyer and the Franeker fox. Thank you. That's my head.
We can have a few minutes for questions after that tour de force. I'm sure there are many. That was amazing, Jaap.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any questions? Anybody want to start off? First one? Guess it was right here.
Or just overwhelming. It's quite a lot, actually. Haha.
Was there anybody here?
The question is, who ultimately won? The English. No, seriously. Boo, yeah. No, seriously, I think that van der Donck having to retire from public life, promising not to meddle in politics anymore, makes him the loser if we just look at it as a conflict between 2 men. But as I've shown, there's a lot more to it about that. There are links here to political factions in the Dutch Republic. Who won there? Amsterdam. Please use the microphone.
I noticed I noticed an inconsistency in, since you are Dutch, I take it, in van der, sometimes, and I live in America, and I'm trying to teach the Americans to do it right, but this is not happening. And I was hoping that a Dutch person would, not with a capital, but with the small letters. And you have some of them right and some of them not right. And my second remark would be, oh my God, now I forgot. Van der Capelle is not Dutch. That's not Dutch grammar. It's either Van den Capelle or Van de Capelle. Sorry. But I thought your lecture was great.
Well, thank you for the third part of your question. As to the first part, the modern rule in Dutch is to capitalize the van if there is no first name, but leave out the capitalization if there is a first name. If I made a mistake, please later on show me where it was. As to Van der Capellen, it actually is a Dutch name. And this is a well-known Dutch noble family. There's still Van der Capellens around. I'm sorry if they spelled your name in a way that makes you think that it's not Dutch, but actually they are.
Yeah, as I was listening, it seems in the whole description that Stuyvesant really didn't do very much.
Well, what I have to explain here is that in many ways, what we have are the documents from the States General. We don't have the New Netherland Council minutes for 1651 until 53 about. I could be wrong there, but so most of the documents we have pertain to the Dutch Republic and display the actions of Van der Donck, his point of view. It actually took me quite a lot of reading between the lines to see what he had done, what Stuyvesant had done. Stuyvesant was informed, he was kept informed, and I have to say there are dirty tricks here that I left out. Keep in mind that this is a talk of 6,000 words about, which is a summary of an article of 10,000 words, which is a summary of a chapter of 50,000 words. Now, there are several points in New Netherland too where both men used tricks. For instance, when Stuyvesant in the early situation in 1650 is ordered to return, 1649, he is issued with a statement by the States General, and you need to reply to something like that. It needs to be an official reply. The only man in the Dutch colony that could write an authenticated document was Stuyvesant's secretary, Cornelis van Tienhoven. So Van der Donck and Melijn go over to Van Tienhoven and ask him, please make a copy for us. No, not going to happen. There were no notaries as yet in New Amsterdam. So what they do, what Van der Donck and Melijn do, is when they go back to The Hague, is they recruit a notary to send him over to New Amsterdam. A notary can only make legal documents if he is appointed, as the phrase goes, by the city government or of the state's government, the States of Holland in most cases, as it is in Amsterdam notarial documents. And that's what you find with later notaries as well. But first, this permission to act as notary is refused. So it goes on like that. This is administrative warfare, which sounds very familiar. So, but you are absolutely right. There is a problem with sources here, and that is why there is more of an emphasis in my story on the Dutch side than there is on the New Netherlands side. No, you're absolutely right there.
My sense was that Stuyvesant had a fairly autocratic rule, although he had the 9 men, and a lot of times, especially when it came to religious policies, he really pushed his religious policies. So when it comes to Adriaen van der Donck, my sense when beginning of your lecture that he was trying to institute some sense of reform and maybe democratize it, but toward the end you mentioned that it would be sort of like the patroons taking over, and that doesn't sound that all that democratic to me. or that much reform, that much as in a reform sense. So was his a desire to create reform that would be a little bit more democratic?
There are 2 points there. First, was Stuyvesant an autocrat? All government in the Netherlands is collective government. Stuyvesant was the first member of Director General and Council. All decisions were taken in that name. Now, he was the only full member, you might say, in the sense that he had a full-time occupation. So did actually the fiscaal and no, actually there were more than that. The vice director, Lubbert van Dinklage, was full-time, and the fiscaal too. The other members were part-time advisors. Stuyvesant, like the situation in the States General, was the one who chaired the meeting, who determined the agenda, and would bring things to a vote. If he brought things to a vote, he could be outvoted, and actually he was quite a number of times. If the perception is that he acted autocratically, it was because he was an authoritarian figure, an authority based on his position and very much on his conviction. He was a staunch Calvinist. He was right because God told him so. The second point there is democracy. I think we should be very careful in using that dirty word as it was perceived in the 17th century. Rule by the people, God help us. So this was a struggle for power, for political power, about who was in charge.
So it would have been just just a change of,
What you find is it's actually quite, and I didn't put those examples in the paper here, but what we have, for instance, in Dordrecht, in the late 1640s, when William II was already the stadtholder. We have a situation there where there is a group of people around the guilds with the help of one specific lawyer, again a lawyer, who are advocating against the city government of Dordrecht. Both parties appeal to the States of Holland. The stadtholder intervenes. And because he didn't particularly like the city government of Dordrecht, which had the family De Witt of later fame in it, for instance, it's clear what he did. After 1650, after his death, things turned around. Similarly, the city of Nijmegen had obtained the right to appoint its own burgomasters. That was a right that was granted for the sake of warfare. It was a city where actually what was on the front line. After 1648, there was peace. So Nijmegen thought, we'll go on doing this. William II came along with his army, and they didn't do it anymore. And similar incidents are all over the Dutch Republic. And if you look at this conflict playing out in New Netherlands and in the Dutch Republic over who had the final word in New Netherlands, it's very, very similar. And that's what I mean by conflict. But again, there are some things that I had to leave out here.
After Van der Donck's death, there's a reference in the court minutes to Stuyvesant saying, I think he says something like our late friend, which Russell presumes is a reference to Van der Donck. And do you agree that he's referring to Van der Donck, and is that just sort of a term of nicety, or what is the evidence for their relationship after he returns?
After Van der Donck returns in 1653, Stuyvesant is not really very pleased. He really tries to keep Van der Donck at a distance. And he's actually admonished by the West India Company directors for that. But it's only a short time, of course. I think in September 1653 or something like that, Van der Donck is finally back, and he dies in September 1655 in the so-called Peach War. And there's a reference in the account books of Rensselaerswijk to his widow being ransomed. And there are in the Orphan Master records, I think, at your archive, there are 2 references to servants of him having been killed. So that's an indication that Donck, up in the Bronx, was attacked. So it's circumstantial, and of course we know that his widow later remarried, but that's 10 years later or so. But that's all we have. As to the specific mark about our late friend, I would have to look at the context. I don't know. So, and I'm hesitant to give an answer until I've actually checked the documents. 2 questions there.
So one was before you. You'll be next.
I just have a broad, unscholarly question. Had it turned out differently, do you think it would have affected what happened in New Amsterdam with the British taking over and everything? Should it have been the opposite?
Counterfactual history is such an interesting game to play. I don't think so. My impression of Stuyvesant throughout these 17 years is that at first he is beset by problems and overreacts, not just towards the colonists, but also towards the English. By 1653, he's much more experienced. He has effectively, through creating the city government, created a situation that all parties involved could recognize, because it was along the Dutch standards. And Stuyvesant, in subsequent interactions with the English, is always on top of things. He outwits the English in 1653. He writes a reply to the usurpations attempted from Maryland in 1657, and those documents, which I'll talk about in Poughkeepsie in 2 days' time, are actually very interesting because they show that he really knew legally what he was talking about. Would that have been different? Well, actually, it's the situation in Europe, the restoration of 1660, that has an impact here, and the subsequent rise of affection at the English court under James II, the brother of Charles II. So it's James II, who later becomes James II, but is then Duke of York, who feeds into the discontent of the English towards the Dutch, not just in New Netherland, which is of course attacked in peacetime in 1664, but also on the West African coast and in other places. Would that have been different if Stuyvesant or Van der Donck, one or the other, had been in position? I don't think so, actually. So I think it's larger factors that determined the situation.
You indicated that your research showed many parallels in 300 years ago to what's happening today. Could you expand on that for us? And bring it maybe up to date to show whether the conflicts or the interest have really not changed in some respects, although the personalities may have.
The personalities have, yes. Now, I suppose that in some ways dirty politics are of all times. The extent to which they are accepted by society changes. Now, what we see in the Dutch Republic and in New Netherland between 1647 and 1653 is less transparent than it would appear from a talk like this. Some measures were taken and nobody ever knew. Some of these behind-the-back dealings, people who are in contact, it's a reconstruction on the basis of facts, of course. I know that Melijn went to Hendrik van der Capelle because there is a letter that says so. And if you look at the dates with other documents, you can just reconstruct in how many days he went from his arrival in Amsterdam to Gelderland. Why would he go there? It's that reconstruction, and that's where the detective work really comes into it. It's contacts. It's not what you know, but who you know. And that hasn't changed. Question over here.
I recently read a translation, an English translation of letters from ministers in New Netherlands, and they complained about Stuyvesant that he didn't do enough, and they complained about the West India Company that they didn't want to spend enough money to populate New Netherlands, to thereby relieve the pressure from the English, who were supported much more and who came to this country, this continent, and so they also blame inaction by the West Indian Company.
Oh yeah, I think that if you look at the situation in 1664, the West India Company did as much as it could, which wasn't much. Especially after 1654, the fall of Brazil, it was beset by people claiming money from them. So they couldn't invest in New Netherlands. They couldn't send over more troops than they did, and whether it would have made any difference is to be questioned. But again, let's look at, because I think what you read is a letter that is in the New Netherlands relatives. No, that's not relatives. What is it? Narratives. Yeah, the Jameson edition of 1909, I think it was. That is one specific letter written after the takeover. The takeover is a wholly different story, and again, I'm not giving a paper on that right now, but in many ways there is more to it than meets the eye too there. In my view, Stuyvesant tries to play for time after the English arrive, after the English ships arrive, and he tries to avoid getting his hands dirty and tries to avoid leaving a paper trail. So he doesn't actually sign the articles of transfer. He lets other people do that. He doesn't fight, but he cannot immediately surrender. His role is one of saving his honor, but at the same time taking care of the community that God had entrusted to him. And that means that you cannot just start shooting and have the English bombard New Netherlands, New Amsterdam, and blow everything to smithereens. It won't do. But if he had given up an hour after the English ships arrived, he would have been a coward. So he played for time, gradually withdrew from the process, did not allow the city government an authentic copy of the letter that Nichols had sent him, but allows them to make their own copy, which doesn't stand up in court. All of that had the result that the city was saved, and after a few weeks, the ministers, but also the population, understood that. So both declarations that are made in Amsterdam in 1667 as to his behavior and the letter that you refer to are actually in his support. But that's a different paper. If you have another 45 minutes, I can...
We have time for one more.
Thank you for your wonderful talk. Adriaen van der Donck, nevertheless, is close to our heart today because of the recent, or relatively recent, good translation for the first time. So we hope he will have a sort of comeback in spite of his fighting left and right, and because of his description of New Netherland and his description of nature and the fact that he thinks it's funny that the English make this sort of cake out of pumpkin. These things are very charming, and they're not only charming, they're extremely important. Can you say something of that? And where is he buried, or you never found his body?
I never looked for his body, of course. We know where Stuyvesant is, of course. I would... I'm almost inclined to say that I would like to see Stuyvesant dug up, but that's not going to happen anytime soon. So I think Adriaen van der Donck is a remarkable figure. He clearly had the interests of New Netherlands at heart, which makes it all the more tragic, because he chose the wrong side. His description is a wonderful book. And actually, if you look at the remonstrance, some of the information that later is in the description is already in the remonstrance, but he leaves out all the political stuff. And if you look at the two documents next to each other, it's clear how his opinion changes. The description, published in 1655, republished in 1656, when he's already dead, are aimed at propagating colonization of New Netherlands. It's why Van der Donck hires servants to work at his patroonship. If more people come over, he would benefit. But it's not just benefit. There are other ideas as well. He just took a different decision. The decision not to oppose Stuyvesant and the West India Company anymore. And that's actually, their aims were, as I can see it, pretty much the same. What I mentioned as to the Brede Raad, the broad advice, the anti-merchant rhetoric in there does not in itself indicate that Van der Donck was a supporter of the ideology that nobility should rule the country. Not in itself. But it may not have been a very good decision to go that way.
So, thank you, Jaap, so much. And Jaap will be signing his books over there if anyone would like to purchase one. And thank you all for coming. Good night.